Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Mind Matters. Today, we're going to be returning to the discussion a couple weeks ago that we had on Witzel's Origins of the World's Mythologies. Here's that book again. So we're going to talk about the last chapter, the one that we hadn't read yet when we did that show. So for all those listeners and viewers who are upset that we hadn't finished the book, well, we finished the book, and now we will talk about that. Because that's actually some of the most, well, what I find to be some of the most interesting things. Like we talked about pretty much the basics of the skeleton of what the book's about in the previous show, which is like the majority of the book, basically just making his case for those two contemporary systems of mythology that stretch back like 50, 60,000 years to their original forms back then. And just all the evidence for that. So he gets into all of the comparative mythology, from all kinds of different regions and oral and textual sources for all of these myths. And so he pretty much makes his point, makes his case over the period of over the several hundred pages of the book. And it's kind of hard to discuss all that if you without just getting into all the minutiae, like all the little minor details. So if you're interested in that, then you really have to read the book to see just how he makes the case with all of that data. And but what he does in the last chapter is kind of sums it up and basically gives his thought on kind of the overall meaning and significance of these mythological systems. So in that chapter, what he basically does, he highlights about 6 areas and themes that that kind of account for that. Not only the longevity, but the longevity and the reason for that longevity, the possible reasons for that longevity. Because what made this system of mythology, this narrative structure, this storyline, what made that survivable? Like, why did it stick around for so long? Why wasn't it just like a story? Like, just if you look in contemporary culture, you look at the number of books published, for instance, every year, and you go back 100 years and you look at all the books published, and the vast majority of them no one reads anymore. They're out of print. They've just fallen off the face of the earth. So what makes something last, essentially? This is what Nicholas Nassim Taleb would call like the Lindy effect. It's something that has something about it that makes it last, that makes it relevant today, even though it might have been written thousands of years ago. That's why he talks about how that's one of the important things that used to be in education with the study of the classics, because you were reading things that were still relevant today, that have stood the test of time, and are still relevant, still meaningful. And there's so that is a kind of test of a sorts of in just the history of human culture, what lasts and what doesn't. There's kind of this almost Darwinian process with ideas where bad ideas, maybe some good ideas too, but bad ideas, there's something about some ideas that makes them not last. It makes them very like situation and context dependent, and after a generation or two, they're just discarded. They're not remembered. They don't make any impact. I know Taleb would argue that chances are, if something doesn't survive, then it didn't have very much value. But there's always going to be exceptions. So there's always going to be like the undiscovered or the forgotten classic, the book or piece of music that was written hundreds of years ago or 100 years ago that kind of fell out of favor and no one really remembered it, and then someone rediscovers it and says, "Oh wow, this is like a masterpiece, a forgotten masterpiece that like our current culture has neglected." And it may experience a kind of renaissance, but probably in most cases that's not what's happening. It's just things get forgotten for a reason. It's because most of not everything that gets produced can be exceptional. But by definition, there's, whether it's in music or the arts or any kind of writing or academia, there's going to be the vast majority of stuff that is just kind of like blah, that's not really even worth remembering, just because it doesn't make an impact. It's not saying anything original. But there's going to be that small minority of like cultural productions that that are relevant then and will continue to be relevant. And so that's what he's saying about the Laurasian mythological system, is that there's something about it that, well, there must have been something about it that was significant because it's lasted, arguably, for like 50,000 years in its overall structure. Some of the details have changed and morphed over time for sure, but there's something in that structure that has allowed it to like withstand the test of time. And so one of the first of the kind of 6 areas that he focuses on, well, just overall, before we get into those 6, he basically, one of the reasons that he gives for this longevity is that you can read this mythological storyline, this narrative, as essentially a metaphor for life. So it'll be relevant in some way, and even in a symbolic way, perhaps even in an unconscious way, to every human being, because it's representative of their life in its universal aspects. So I'll just going to read a couple paragraphs on that to give an idea of where he's going to go with his discussion here. So he writes, the Laurasian storyline, thus, is a metaphor of the human condition, of human life from its mysterious beginnings to its impending ominous end. It was the genial stroke of the creator of Laurasian mythology that it correlates and thus explains at the same time both the universe and the human condition, where we came from, why we are here, and where we will go. Laurasian myth is a metaphor applied to everything around us, to the world and to the divine powers that govern it. It answers in an encoded and shrouded way, and on a symbolic and metaphoric level, the eternal question, why are we here? Viewed from the present vantage point, after detecting the Laurasian storyline, Laurasian ideology seems to be based on a fairly simple idea, the correlation of the life of humans and the universe. But someone, about 40,000 years ago, had to come up with it first, and it is closely related to the concepts of the Paleolithic hunt, the rebirth of animals, and shamanism. As it is closely related to these things, it must have been a shaman who did so. So he's giving his thought on what individual or group of individuals must have come up with it, given the historical context of the time. So he links that to shamanism. Also, that's supporting, and well, that is supported by various other parts in the book where he's talking about the hunter-gatherer like systems and societies, cultures, and how they were like shaman-centered, and the shaman would be the one who passed on the mythological tradition, all the stories and myths, and so it makes sense that it would be the shaman that came up with it in the first place. So, excuse me. One other thing on the next page. So he adds, yet there is more to the Laurasian novel. Its myths work on many levels, as all well-constructed myths and other artistic creations should indeed do. Laurasian myth, then he's got a few bullet points. So the first, is an interesting story in itself, one that people like to retell constantly and elaborate on. 2, is based throughout on common human experience, something that, due to common human brain structure, is easily translatable, understandable, and applicable by correlation to the world around us. And 3, offers an explanation of the human condition and of the world around us in our own human terms. So just in there, we've got this kind of overall explanation for why it's so universal and why it's universally applicable, and therefore maybe why it's lasted for 40,000 years or more. And this gets into some of this is where what he's saying might have the most resonance with like a Jungian approach or like Jordan Peterson. Because like we said in the last show, he doesn't really give much credence to Jung's hypothesis that the universals in world mythologies come down to like this shared instinctive like collective unconscious. Because, well, first of all, because it's demonstrably not true that all cultures share all of these elements. There are only a few features, like he argues in the sections on Gondwana and before that the Pangean myth system. There's only a few features that are shared universally, and it doesn't really resemble much the Jungian approach. Like I read a couple of Jung's books, like one on the psychology and alchemy, where he's looking at Wolfgang Pauli's alchemical dreams, and that's one of his arguments for this collective unconscious, is that Pauli couldn't have known about these alchemical imagery, like symbols and images, and that it must come from the collective unconscious. The implication being that anyone at any point at any time in the in human history could have had the same dreams and the same alchemical images. Well, Witzel would say that's probably a stretch if you look at the actual history and the actual record of what mythological systems and symbols and images there actually are. So, and then there's that idea of, that's what he wouldn't agree with about Jung, but what he would agree with is that there is kind of like a universal human, a shared human nature, essentially, that that these myths can speak to and account for, and be applied to. So this is where like Jordan Peterson's approach in Maps of Meaning is kind of relevant, where he gets into he tries to find the really true like universals and relate them to basic psychological processes and brain chemistry on one level, or on another level. So there's this kind of multi-level approach where the myths, I mentioned this in the last show that we did on it, there's like the literal storyline, but then there's kind of like the hidden meanings and the suggested meanings that kind of speak more to the subconscious, that don't speak in literal words, but speak on this more symbolic kind of metaphorical level. And people do respond to that, and they, like, if you do any study into like filmmaking, for instance, like a good filmmaker understands this and understands that, well, and not only a filmmaker, but like film score composers, like they understand that there are certain like techniques and just certain ways that people respond to either certain types of music or the combination of certain types of images, even like directional things, like people will respond to symmetry or perspective, certain things in or out of perspective, or left-right dichotomies, up-down, and just certain kinds of cutting, and all this stuff that's speaking on a non-verbal level, that's saying something on a non-verbal level. So there's going to be that going on in this myth too. So that's kind of what he gets into with his six subheadings, six subsections in this bit.
Well, just a quick note on the subject of films and filmmaking. I recently watched a movie called King Kong Skull Island.
That's a great one.
And I was thinking about Witzel's point about local cultures depending on millennia of path dependencies that have made their way into modern realizations. And arguably most screenwriters are influenced by other film, other stories, other novels. If they've read any religious literature, obviously that's going to be an influence. But there are certainly a number of elements to that one film, and probably a lot of others, that include the conflict of monsters, the incorporation of the rituals of the native people, which seem to be a kind of a modern day watered down pop culture translation of Laurasian myth making, or the first great novel, as Witzel likes to call it. But aside from that, Harrison, I was wondering where he would go with all of this, because, like you said, I mean, this is a few hundred pages of comparative mythology, where he's breaking down the kind of mytho themes and motifs of all of these different cultures that span throughout the world and thousands of years, and says, well, yes, Indo-Iranian mythology also had this dragon slaying myth that's in common with the Japanese myth, except with this discrepancy. But still, there are so many correspondences over time, again, time and space, that you're forced to pay attention to all of these and to think on the fact that there is this kind of larger story that has perpetuated itself through thousands of years, and that arguably has influenced what is now the world's three or four largest religions. And he even traces those thousands of year old myths to the New Testament, the Old Testament, Islam,
and even as far forward as the kind of secular myths like communism, like Maoism. Like he's got some references there, how the same things are going on with these modern movements. And he gives this funny example. I don't know if I can find it quick, but he's talking about like these modern versions and how just the ways in which they've been adapted in modern culture. And so he gives the example. I should be able to find it really quick here. So I'll just read this paragraph because I thought it was pretty interesting. Myth reasserts itself even in societies that propose to do away with traditional culture, such as the former Soviet Union and communist Korea and China. Merely new myths or new versions of existent myths were created. Again, in Cassire's words, they were brought into being by the word of command of the political leaders. We have the Stakhanov myth of the successful worker in the Soviet Union and the miraculous birth of Kim Il-sung on a mountain in North Korea. Instead, he was born near Pyongyang. And his transformation into a war hero. Instead, he stayed away from the front in the Soviet Union during World War II. Or there are various stories and picture books of the 60s and 70s about young Chinese heroes who, Mao style, overcame all natural and human-made difficulties, relying on Mao in their heart, just like others have Jesus or Rama in their hearts. And during the Chinese Cultural Revolution, dozens of such tales were created and propagated in comic books, theater, films, and so on.
Right. It's Witzel seems to be making the point that that these new socialist and communist political movements have kind of mythologized themselves, but have appropriated the lone rider mythology that is so common in a lot of mythologies that Campbell would talk about towards their own ends, where they're kind of doing away with so much of the old traditional religious tribal myths that have come down and that they have recordings of, and in their place kind of vaunted themselves into this new position. And what was so interesting also is Witzel thinking on how, like, just bringing all of this wealth of knowledge and insight he has to the current day, and saying for his readers, for his audience, for his students, that there's something of value in looking back at this, the greatest story ever told, arguably, and not discarding it in the way that these political movements, and in the way that fundamentalist thinking has taken over many of the world's religions in their way. So he said that kind of presents itself as something of a threat, that the polytheism, the kind of traditions of cultures that have taken all of these stories to heart and have revivified them over many years by reenacting the rituals, by sharing the stories, by even adding their own kind of their own spin or their own cultural interpretation of them. That's what helped keep many societies and cultures cohesive, and has arguably given meaning to their existence in trying to answer the age-old questions that you presented at the top of the show. So he's really kind of thought about it in a holistic way. I mean, he even presents towards the very end the possibility that we may have to as a human race come up with new mythology. But somehow you think that given the long-lasting effects and pertinence of all the other of the Laurasian story, that it would somehow, I think, fit into this newer mythology, or would need to fit, considering how significant they are.
Yeah, and that's the problem with the modern myths, especially the modern secular myths. And this is something that Peterson talks about too in Maps of Meaning. Is that there's a reason that they lead to disaster. In every case, it's because they're missing something essential. They're like they've like chopped out essential portions of the previous mythology, and you're left with this kind of caricature of the original system that applies to like all of life, like Witzel says, like a complete story and explanation of all the facts, basically. Whereas like modern, like the modern scientific worldview and the modern big ideologies are they're like too skinny. They're like anorexic versions of these other myths. They're missing the meat of what makes these myths work, what made them work, and and so the reason for that, like the reasons that he gives for that, for these original myths, like the things that make them work. So I'll talk about the one I just mentioned, the total explanatory force of them. This is the sixth point that he makes. Basically, that's the reason that they were so effective, is that they did cover everything, or they attempted to, at least. Well, they provided an answer, whether that answer was like true or not, in the sense that we think of as truth, scientific truth. That at least it was a coherent answer. There was like an entire worldview into which everything fit, from like the physical facts to the spiritual facts to the moral structure and the societal structure of everything, and that is what gives meaning. So when you have a system that is lacking, let's say the spiritual element, which is tied to the moral element, like the actual force for what should be done in the world, like what true and good action, right action should be. When that's missing, you don't have a compass for where you're going. You don't have a direction for where you're going, and that leaves open the possibility that you're going to go in a very wrong direction. So I want to read one quote on that point that Witzel makes. He writes, Laurasian mythology achieves this by a framework familiar to early humans, that of human life, of birth and death, of several generations, and of clan interaction. The human life cycle, bisexuality, by that he means like, male and female, family and small-scale society are woven into a well-built structure with many levels of meaningful tales, a novel that explains our origins and that of everything around us, in the anthropomorphic image of procreation, birth, growing up, aging, and death. Significantly, the scheme also holds out the hope, even the certainty, for rebirth, both for oneself and for the world. He calls this overall framework a garden of symbols. It's a nice image of the whole mythological structure. So it basically lays out, he summarizes there the points he makes in the other five. These are the features that kind of like the symbolic features of this whole system. And just to summarize from like the last show, for those who either haven't seen it or have forgotten, like the main overall like Laurasian storyline is like the creation of the earth, the generations of the gods, the descent of humans from one of those gods, the origin of then human society, leading then to a catastrophe, a cataclysm, where the earth is destroyed and preparing it for a new birth. That's the Laurasian storyline in a nutshell. And within that, you have all the kind of individual myths. So you've got stories like the flood story, or tales of like cosmic and divine destruction, and well, the generations of the gods, the different types of gods in various systems, like the Titans in the in the Greek system, or the Asuras, I think, or and in the one of the like ancient Indian systems, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's the overall framework and the overall storyline, and the way he interprets that is as kind of like I've said before, a kind of symbol and metaphor for life. And I'd just say that that's just one. So just one correspondence, even if it might be the biggest one. So we're going to get into some of the other kind of correspondences and what we see in that, as we go on today. Like, so the first one that he talks about is just the life cycle. So like what you have in this mythological storyline is the life cycle of the universe, like the birth and death of the world. And you see that in the origin myths, the creation myths for the world. Oftentimes, the world is born out of an egg, like animals, whether a bird egg or like an ovum. Life is birthed and comes from an egg, and so the early universe was perceived the same way. And sometimes with the combination of two fluids, like the salty sea and blood, representative of the seed and blood of produced by humans in those regions, those regions of their bodies, I should say. And so there's this very organic imagery of the creation of the universe, of the origin of the universe, that will for anyone familiar with being a human, that will resonate on some level. Like it will pluck at those metaphorical, strings that we have somewhere in our consciousness that it rings a bell. But not only that, there's another aspect or another kind of metaphor or kind of analogy that speaks to, and that is that like getting back to some of the shows that we've done previously on Dabrowski, like this idea of positive disintegration. Now, this seems to me to be one of these fundamental things that isn't explicitly recognized by most people in general, including like academics, that there is this process of positive disintegration that is inherent in just the structure of reality, not just in human consciousness, like Dabrowski points out in like psychological positive disintegration, but this process of like the only reason that something can grow or change or develop is by like a destruction of the previous thing, the pre-existent thing. So like with the world in this mythology, that shows up in the overall framework of the final destruction, creating the ground for creating the soil for the growth of the new world, but also in individual myths. So with like the slaying of the dragon, which shows up all over in Laurasian myth, and then the most the most resonant example for Western culture, the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. That is this process of the death of something resulting in a rebirth. This is like a universal symbol that applies not only to all myths, but to something about human nature, but also about like reality itself. This like the structure of reality. When you look at even like chemistry and physics, there's this like destructive element that like even just the interaction between different elements, different molecules, where its previous form is destroyed in some way to make way for the new form. Losing electrons or losing like neutrons or protons. Like there's these processes of transformation that go on that are necessary for the production of new things, whether it's like a new isotope or a new molecule or up to macroscopic objects like just anything that you create with your hands. You have to deform the old shape in order to create a new shape. And it's the same thing with psychology, with personality. If in order to refine your personality, in order to develop your character, there are things about your old character or your present character that have to be destroyed or reshaped or reformed. That means like chopping some parts off, burning some parts, or however killing them. Like that's where that imagery comes into play. So there's something universal about not just the life cycle, but about experience itself that is summed up in this overall storyline. And then he, like the second one he gives is mentioned, the duality of nature. So in these you have at the very beginning often you have like Father Heaven and Mother Earth or Mother Nature, and like the so there's this split of reality into this duality, and you see that not only in sexuality with the male and the female, but with right combined in those two divine figures, you have the heaven and the earth. There's this duality between like the above and the below, and and that too is applicable on so many levels, just to all types of duality, and those themes are explored in all these myths. I'll get to how that applies in these other ones. The third one he lists is like the universality of like the relations between people, but not just between people. I'd say just the universality of relation, of like the relational nature of the universe, I guess. And that applies on the level of individuals and families and clans, and like the social responsibilities and the just the relational nature of life. Especially when you look back in a hunter-gatherer society where, like, what would the phrase be? Like the extreme individualism, where that wouldn't work. Like you can't isolate yourself and elevate yourself from other people in such a situation. You have to cooperate to some degree, like because your survival is dependent on like other people, and other people's survival is dependent on you. It has to be this cohesive. Like you have to be operating to some degree as a collective, with like mutual kind of social responsibility.
Well, just to add to that, a couple of the things he kind of gives credence to is the fact that this tribe or family unit or group unit is in microcosm a symbol or a representation of the relationship between the gods and the deities,
right?
And that it's this incorporation. It's this saying, I am at my level, but I do have something in common in my function, in my relevance, in my in the meaning of my life when I not necessarily identify with the gods in a way that would suggest hubris, but that as a unit, as part of a unit, my function is important, and that I don't function outside of this tribe or in relation to other people who share a connection and a reverence for the relations between the gods and the deities and the conflicts and the struggles that they have been presented as having through the stories, through the mythologies. So in that way, I think he also says that there's a great amount of meaning that's been incorporated by this kind of, for lack of a better word, identification with or connection to the way that the gods have had to go on their adventures and engage in their struggles and do the things that they do in order to exist, in order to bring the story forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that relates to the like some of the further points where he's talking about they kind of all mix together, like that. I mentioned the above below, like duality. One of the main themes of this system is that everything on the lower part, everything within the lower part of creation, so like the earth, everything on the earth, so all of nature and human interactions are mirror images in some sense of what's going on in the heavens, in the upper regions of the universe. And so there's this correlation between the divine realm and the earthly realm. And so it works in all these different directions. So like there's this relationship with the above, but there's also like our interactions on Earth, on our level, will also mirror something within that other realm too. So this gets to, or there's an implication here that is one of the main themes of Laurasian myth, which is the way I see it. It's kind of like it embeds this recognition of cause and effect, and the idea of basically like responsibility. And this is found often in the like the destruction myths. So there's a link. So there's a moral element here. So this is like an injunction to do this and don't do this, because bad things will happen if you do this. And that's a basic. Again, that's just something universally true about human nature, about experience itself. That some things work and some things don't. So the way the Laurasian myth spells it out, often in the flood myth, is that someone does something wrong. It might be a woman or a man. Like in the Bible, it's Eve that gets deceived by that dastardly snake, and then influences Adam to eat that apple, and bad things happen. But there are often that same theme shows up all over the place. So there's something that some human does wrong, often like violating a taboo, eating something they shouldn't, doing something that they shouldn't, that brings the wrath of the gods, of the heavens upon them and causes destruction. Within that, there's the overall theme, I think, of this cause and effect and responsibility. It's like what you do matters. There are certain things that if you do them, you'll be setting yourself up for disaster, and you might be setting up more than just yourself for disaster. Like there's this aspect of like almost collective responsibility, where it's like where humans, like humanity, is on the wrong path, like doing the wrong thing, and bad things will happen as a result of that. And like the moral of that story is to do the right thing. Now, whether any specific like moral statement or ethical statement in any of these things is true or not is an open question. Like that's for humans, I think, to discern and develop, on our own, to figure out, what are the right things to do. But the idea is that there is a right and a wrong thing, or there are right and wrong things to do. Some things do lead to disaster. Some things lead to better outcomes than others. Some things work and some things don't. And so in religious terms, you could call that just the doctrine of sin. There are certain things that you can do that miss the mark. Hamartia, the Greek word for sin, tracing back to the root for missing the mark. In an archery competition, there are certain cases where you miss the target, and when you miss the target, well, what you want to do is you want to hit the target, because that's when things are right in the world. That's when you're acting according to your nature. Like to get into maybe some scholastic or Aristotelian philosophy. It's like the humans have a nature, and Laurasian myth would agree with that. And there are certain things within that nature that you do that will be right with not only your nature, but that nature in the context of its mirroring with the higher realms. It's like there's that kind of like that sweet spot of action and of behavior where you're in line with the way things should be, where you're doing the right thing, where which will lead to success of one sort. Not necessarily success in the terms in which you might automatically think success is, but kind of cosmic success. You might have a horrible end like Jesus or something like that. You might have this tragic end, but you might have been doing the right thing. That might have been the right decision to make in that case. And again, that's up to kind of individuals and groups to discover the specifics on their own to see if any of these cultural systems are actually correct. But but that's kind of the overall theme there. And the next one that he gets is related to that, and that's the 4 generations of the gods, because there is that correlation between above and below, that mirroring, that has to do so there's human action that is mirrored in the actions of the gods, or the whatever's going up in those heavenly spheres, and I forget what I was going to say there, but I want to make 2 comments on these 4 generations. because he points out that the four generations. Well, yeah, okay, this is where I was going to go with that. So the correlation, the mirroring aspect is you have these four generations of the gods, but the mirroring on the, in our world is the four generations of life, the four seasons of life. There's this like symbolic or metaphorical like relationship between the two. So you have these four generations of the gods. Well, what can that possibly say about human life? And there's a couple different directions. One is, well, there's a few. Well, there's probably multiple. But the two that came to mind were because I think it was like a few years ago, it might have been in like 2016, we did a Truth Perspective show. I think it was on Ponerology, but we talked about this idea, like the fourth turning, by William Strauss and Neil Howe. And the reason we brought this up was because I think it was Steve Bannon was talking about it. Mm-hmm. He's like, oh, the fourth turn is coming, and kind of like going Alex Jones on everyone about the disaster that's coming to American society and world society. There's going to be a war with China and all this stuff. And but I was interested because I had this book, and I wanted to know what it was all about. And it's basically like, you don't have to be a fan of Steve Bannon to kind of appreciate what's the stuff in this book. What they're basically saying is that that there is this four generation theme that seems to show up, and they trace it back to mythology too. So they're talking about like all of these different myth systems, like the Romans, the Greeks, the Chinese, Babylonians. Basically making the same observation that Witzel did about the almost near universality of this four generations theme. But like I said, there are these two applications of it. The first one is in what they're arguing is that there is a recurring pattern in history of four generations. So you'll have one generation has a certain character. The next generation after that, so their children will have a different character, and so on for four different generations. In that fourth generation, there will usually be a crisis of some sort, mm-hmm. and then the cycle repeats. That fourth generation has children, and their character happens to resemble the character four generations ago, and it just repeats these four kind of archetypal generational patterns just keep repeating. And so you can divide history into these kind of like 80 to 90 year segments and find these recurring patterns. And that's essentially what this book is finding these patterns in American history, finding these different sequences of generations. So the Romans called them like a cycula, like a secular, like a rotation. I can't remember what cycula actually means, but they find these, like what they call like quaternities in all these different cultures. So like the Buddhists and the Maya, the Dakota, the Bible, and so it was often called like a great year. A great year was divided into four seasons, and the great year might be like thousands of years or something. But there was but these cultures also had this idea of the great generation. So like which kind of corresponds to the life cycle of one person. So what Witzel does is he brings this down to just the basic human experience of your family relations, because the most common the most common number of ancestors or like relations that you have is often 3 or 4. So if you imagine yourself, if you're like a young adult, you'll have children, you'll have parents and grandparents. So your children will basically have great grandparents, 4 generations. So it's usually like unless you're lucky enough to have some great grandparents that stick around, that's usually probably a more modern phenomenon. If you when you have people living into their 90s or their hundreds, for the most part, most people will only ever have experience of their grandparents or their great grandparents, and within that structure, that family structure, you've got all 4 generations represented. And that so it's kind of like this interlocking and interweaving system of generations. So in your one life, you've got experience of all these generations, but it plays out over the entire life cycle of that entire 90-year cycle that's just kind of going like this, throughout all of history. And so that's how Witzel connects it. It's basically the 4 generations of the gods relate to like the 4 seasons of man. So like your childhood, your young adulthood, or no, like what are the? I've got it here. The 4 seasons: the childhood, young adulthood, midlife, and elderhood, and that's a common thing among most cultures too. Is the division of the individual life into those 4. Those 4 pattern, or those four what's the word, like stages of life, essentially. And so that's in Witzel's system, that the Laurasian myth is like, just like there's the overall storyline which applies to like birth and death, so the life cycle of a human. The 4 generations are also kind of a symbolic, or like a higher, like metaphorical, symbolic representation of the 4 generations within one cycle, within one great generation, and the 4 stages of life, from infanthood to old age. There's this universality to the human experience, again, to the individual life cycle divided into 4, but also in that individual life in relationship to the other generations, the ones before you and the ones that come after you. So you start out as an infant with your 3 generations before you, and then as you get older, you become the great-grandparent with the great-grandchildren. So all interactions between those 4 generations are represented and experienced over the course of a life. If you're one of the one of the humans that manages to have children, because historically and presently, not all do, and not all are able to, or have historically been able to. So, but overall, it's kind of like this universally applicable system that will resonate with people, whether they consciously realize it or not, just because it matches in some nonverbal way, often some kind of analogical way that speaks to the unconscious, as opposed to just spelling it out. It's not like, a myth wouldn't work if you just said, oh, there are great grandparents, grandparents, parents, and children, and there is a 90-year cycle where all do these things. It's like, right. No one's good. Like, that's not.
No, it works on multiple levels,
right.
And it's not. It doesn't have a direct, literal interpretation necessarily. But when you were describing that, it reminded me a little bit of this interview I recently watched with Charles Nenner, who's one of these trends forecasters, who talks about cycles quite a bit as well. I haven't read all that much about him, and his website is terribly unimpressive. But one of the things that he mentioned in this interview is that he was invited by Putin to speak to him about the cycles of war and conflict in the world, and about the conflict that is likely to occur within the United States, as well as the United States and other countries in the world as well. And Nenner's gripe was that few people in U.S. media were paying attention at the time when he was meeting Putin in, I think, 2012, and to discuss this. And as a religious man, it's interesting that Putin, well, maybe not so interesting. Maybe that it's part and parcel of his reverence for larger trends and cycles of things to occur. But he sought out Nenner's insight into these cycles of human experience, and it seems to be what's informed the current government of Russia in its kind of approach to geopolitics and conflict. But I did want to get back to a couple of things that occurred to me as you were describing Witzel's, the implications for Laurasian mythology as it's come to manifest in today's world. Just again, bringing this to current events, I was listening to a critique of CNN's climate crisis town hall, which is 7 hours of CNN interviewing Democratic politicians on what they were prepared to do to stave off the climate crisis and what they were prepared to do to uphold, this kind of postmodern, nihilistic, ideologically possessed set of policies that many of them seem to be on board with. And taken out of the equation completely was any sense of morality or God, but put in there was the anthropomorphizing, if I pronounce that correctly, of human beings onto all of these earth changes that we're seeing right now, and onto climate change. Witzel's book does describe a lot of anthropomorphizing, that there is a lot of projection and responsibility taken through these myths on the part of individuals and tribes for how the crop goes, what the state of affairs is on Earth. But it seems to me that this idea has been kind of twisted and subverted by people who have taken out the deity or the God out of the equation, and they're misplacing natural processes in the world with their own political ideology, i.e., the Extinction Rebellion idea. And the other thing that occurred to me was that it's like Witzel says that one of the great values of the mythology, this story, is that it holds out the hope for rebirth, as you were saying earlier, Harrison. That there is more to all of this. That there is the possibility of regeneration, of life afterward. But inherent in that is this kind of a death of some kind that may exist on the personal level or the macro level, and it seems like this idea too has been pathologized in the way that, for instance, Christian Zionism would seek to bring out, the eschaton and the end days in the Middle East by supporting the militant approach on the part of Israel and creating a great Middle Eastern conflagration that would somehow bring on the second coming. So it's as though, we have these ideas that get, it's how is it appropriated? With what intent? Are we forcing the issue in many cases? I think we are, where the mythologies would seek to view them as a natural process and something that shouldn't be forced. So there were those ideas as well that I thought I'd throw into the mix.
Well, just on that, I don't think the anthropomorphize is the right word to use, because it's not that they're anthropomorphizing, like that would be like ascribing human qualities to like climate change, like as if climate change were like a human-shaped God or something that had like intentions. It's that they're making it
induced.
Yeah, anthropogenic.
Anthropogenic.
Yeah. So in the Laurasian mythology, everything in one degree or another is anthropogenic, because human actions are intrinsically like intertwined and related to everything that happens in the universe. So there's like this link, this importance, first of all, in like speech. This is in the fifth point that he makes about the structure of society in the universe, that there is this kind of that it is often speech that brings order to chaos, and that creates, again, something that Jordan Peterson points out in his study of mythology, and that so the cosmos itself, like the cosmos is the cosmos because it's not a chaos. Like there's a chaos that is unstructured and unordered, and then a cosmos is something that is structured and ordered. And so every human action will have an effect on the world, both in the sense that we think of it today in the scientific mindset as like a causal relationship, like the climate change people would say, we make too much CO2 and that CO2 is causing climate change. But in the But in addition to that, the Laurasian myths would say that there's a kind of almost like kind of spooky action in a distance, that like human intentions and behaviors will influence the heavenly realms and what goes on in the world in a way that's like on top of that. So it's the human sin, it's the human mistakes and the bad choices that we make that will bring on like catastrophe, not necessarily through any of the causal mechanisms that science describes. So this gets back to like the one example is the Chinese like myth of what's it called, the heavenly dynasty, or what's the name of the Chinese system? I can't remember. But basically,
that sounds close.
Something like that, where everything's right in the world when the leadership is in line with God, or the heavens, and everything is kind of right in the world. When something gets corrupted, it breaks the connection. It pollutes the connection, and so things are not right in the world anymore. And that's when things start to kind of get shaken up, and it's like when something goes wrong in your car. It's like one thing fails, and then another thing fails, and things just fall apart. It's this entropic process.
Well, I just wanted to interrupt and say real quickly that seems to be part of the issue here, is that if this relationship exists, where the universe, the cosmos, the order of things responds to the sin of human beings, to not doing things in the right way, to not obeying the moral code of the universe, it would seem to be, we're killing lots of people unnecessarily. How much more obvious can it be that under the guise of neoliberalism and bringing freedom and democracy to the world, millions of people and sanctions, millions of people are losing their lives, are suffering horribly because of it. And yet all of this energy gets diverted towards protesting CO2 or some other such nonsense. So again, if there is such a relationship, and there very well may be, between the cosmos and its relationship to individual behavior or the behavior of humanity as a mass, in ignoring these really glaring sins and wrong actions, it would seem to be the fact that we're ignoring the fact that we're slaughtering ourselves under the umbrella of lies and politics and leadership that people are following blindly.
Well, I'm gonna, even though I don't agree with like the Extinction Protocol or any of that, and I agree with you in most of that stuff on principle, I'm just gonna take their perspective and try to give the most charitable interpretation I can to them. So I agree. Yeah, there's all this important stuff going on, and all these bad things that we're doing, primarily, in regard to warfare. On the other hand, I think that there are other reasons not to like pollution, for instance, right? Like there's even if global warming, anthropogenic global warming is a hoax, and CO2 isn't as big a deal as they're making it out to be, there's still no good reason to pollute more than is like absolutely necessary given current technologies.
Absolutely.
So they may be right in a certain sense that even if their projections and their models aren't correct, and the disaster they see coming isn't the disaster that will be coming, it's like there is still a moral but behind having a sound ecological perspective on the way to live on the earth, because when you on the most micro level, it's like the person that just throws their trash outside their window when they're driving in the car. It's like there's something that's just wrong about that.
It's repulsive.
Yeah, and it's like so on an individual and collective level, it's like there are all kinds of things that we do as individuals that are just missing the mark. And I think a lot of forms of pollution are like that. Again, not necessarily to the degree that the Extinction Protocol radicals would think they are, but there's still a kernel of something in there that even would apply to this kind of larger Laurasian perspective. Just wanted to throw that out there.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, when you think about oceans of plastic, when you think about the Exxon Valdez and the Gulf spills, when you think about the nuclear testing that has made our atmosphere filled with various things that are causing cancers at a crazy rate, there's absolutely something to be said about the crime of poisoning the Earth Mother.
Yeah.
So no question, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's a big part of it too. I'm sure. And
the solution that both sides of the debate can get on is fourth generation nuclear, because no CO2 and lots of cheap and efficient energy. So that's the way to go. So, kind of half in jest, but true at the same time.
Just don't build it on any fault lines.
Yeah. So, even then, the fourth gen, apparently, from what I've been reading, are safe in the regard that they will avoid any kind of, that you can't have a meltdown like you have in like older like nuclear power technology. So it's something to consider, something to talk to your representative about, and your local representative. No, sorry, I'm not paid by the nuclear industry. I can assure you of that. One thing, well, we're going to end the show. We're running out of time. But one thing that I want to get to, maybe in a show coming up, I don't know, maybe next week, maybe further on, are some more connections. I started reading this book I mentioned in the show we did on our favorite books of the year. This is one that just came out this year that I hadn't gotten to yet. Graham Hancock's new one, America Before. So I'll just give a quick tease on it. Basically, there's some stuff in this book that we'll talk about that really applies to some of the things in Laurasian mythology. Some things we didn't get to talk about today are the actual role of real destructions in human history. So like cometary bombardments and the impact of kind of natural disasters, real like catastrophic like apocalypses that have happened in human history and their influence on mythology. So we'll get to that and kind of like ancient cultures and their like the actual practices that they used to maintain the connection between the above and the below, and that mirroring of events and structures on Earth and in the heavens. And I'll just leave it at that. Specifically in this book, it's in reference to pre-Columbian American cultures, so North and South America, the mound-building cultures in North and South America, Amazonian, Mississippian, these cultures, the history, like up to several tens of thousands of years ago, and what was going on with these mound-building cultures and what they were actually doing, because I think there's some interesting connections there to be made. So make sure to tune in when we do that show. And with that, thanks for watching today, and we'll see you later.
Take care, everyone.